Margaret Henderson woke up to the sound of rain hitting her bedroom window. She pulled the thin blanket closer to her body, trying to stay warm in the cold October morning. The old house felt empty and quiet, just like it had for the past 3 months since her husband died. She slowly got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. The wooden floors creaked under her feet as she moved through the small house. Margaret opened the refrigerator and stared at the nearly empty shelves. A small container of milk, 2 eggs, and half a loaf of bread. That was all she had left for the week. Her stomach made a soft rumbling sound, but she closed the refrigerator door without taking anything. She had learned to ignore the hunger. It was easier that way. Margaret got dressed in her simple blue dress and cardigan sweater. Pieces of clothing hung loose on her frame now. She had lost so much weight over the past few months that her clothes no longer fit properly. She looked at herself in the mirror and hardly recognized the thin woman staring back at her. Before James died, she had been a healthy woman with rosy cheeks and bright eyes. Now her face looked pale and tired. Dark circles had formed under her eyes from too many sleepless nights, worrying about money and bills. She picked up her worn leather bag and walked outside to her old car. The morning air was crisp and cold, and she could see her breath forming small clouds as she breathed. Winter was coming early this year, and she wasn't ready for it. The drive to Cedar Ridge Elementary School took only 10 minutes, but it felt longer today. Margaret tried not to think about the pile of bills sitting on her kitchen table. The medical bills from James's accident seemed to grow bigger every week. Even though he had died, the hospital still wanted their money. She parked her car in the school parking lot and walked into the building. The hallway smelled like chalk and cleaning supplies, familiar scents that usually made her feel better. But today, even the comfort of her workplace couldn't lift her spirits. Margaret had been teaching at this school for 12 years. She loved working with children and helping them learn to read and write. The kids in her 3rd grade class were sweet and eager to learn. It brought joy to her days, even during this difficult time. But the joy was becoming harder to find. Every day, she watched other teachers eat lunch in the staff room while she sat quietly at her desk, pretending to grade papers. She told everyone she wasn't hungry, but the truth was she couldn't afford to buy lunch at school. Her teaching salary had always been enough when James was alive. He worked at the local farm supply store, and together their income covered their simple lifestyle. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. They had dreams of starting a family and maybe buying a bigger house someday. All of those dreams died with James on that terrible July day. The accident happened so suddenly. James was helping a farmer load heavy equipment when something went wrong with the machinery. The doctors at the hospital tried everything they could, but his injuries were too severe. Margaret spent 3 weeks by his bedside, watching him fight for his life before he finally lost the battle. The medical bills started arriving while she was still planning his funeral. $20,000 for the emergency room visit, $1,000 for the surgery they tried, another $8,000 for the intensive care unit. The numbers were so big they didn't seem real. Margaret tried calling the insurance company, but they found ways to deny most of the claims. They said some treatments weren't necessary. They questioned whether James really needed certain medications. Every phone call left her feeling more frustrated and hopeless. She had used all of their small savings, to pay for the funeral. James deserved a proper burial, and she wasn't going to let him down. But that decision left her with no money to handle the medical bills. Now, sitting in her empty classroom before the students arrived, Margaret pulled out her calculator and the stack of bills. She did the same math she had done dozens of times before, hoping somehow the numbers would change. Her monthly teaching salary was $2,400. After taxes, she took home about $1,900. The rent on their small house was $800. The car payment was $250. Insurance, utilities, and gas took another $300. That left her with less than $600 for food, medical bills, and everything else. The minimum payments on the medical bills alone were $400 per month. That gave her only $200 for groceries and other necessities. It was impossible. Margaret had tried talking to the billing departments at the hospital. She explained her situation and asked if they could reduce the payments. Some were understanding and agreed to lower the monthly amounts. But even the reduced payments were more than she could afford. She had also looked for a second job. But most places in their small town needed evening or weekend workers. As a teacher, her evenings were spent grading papers and preparing lessons. Her weekends were filled with school activities and more preparation. The sound of school buses arriving brought Margaret back to the present moment. She quickly put away the bills and calculator, forcing a smile onto her face. The children would be walking into her classroom soon. They deserved to see their teacher looking happy and confident. The first student to enter was little Amy, a quiet girl with blonde pigtails who always arrived early. Amy's family didn't have much money either, but somehow they always made sure she had what she needed for school. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Amy said with a bright smile. "Good morning, Amy. How are you today?" Margaret replied, her voice warm despite her inner struggles. More children began filing into the classroom, chattering excitedly about their weekend adventures. Margaret listened to their stories and felt grateful for their innocent joy. These children didn't know about medical bills or empty refrigerators. They lived in a world where the biggest worry was whether they remembered to bring their homework. As the morning progressed, Margaret threw herself into teaching. She helped Tommy with his reading, encouraged Lisa to try harder with her math problems, and praised Kevin for his creative writing story. For a few hours, she almost forgot about her troubles, but during lunch break, reality came crashing back. Margaret sat at her desk eating a small apple, the only food she had brought from home. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that an apple wasn't enough for lunch. Through her classroom window, she could see other teachers walking to their cars to grab lunch from home or heading to the local diner. Margaret pretended to be busy with paperwork, too proud to admit she couldn't afford to join them. The afternoon dragged by slowly. Margaret's energy was low, and she found it harder to concentrate on her lessons. The children seemed to notice. Something was wrong, though they were too young to understand what it might be. When the final bell rang and the last student left her classroom, Margaret sat alone in the quiet room. She looked around at the cheerful decorations on the walls, the alphabet charts and motivational posters that usually inspired her. Today, they just reminded her of how far she had fallen from the confident teacher she used to be. Outside, the October wind was getting stronger, and the first few snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall. Winter was coming, and Margaret had no idea how she was going to survive it. The heating bills would start arriving soon, adding another expense she couldn't afford. She gathered her things and walked slowly to her car, dreading the drive home to her empty house and empty refrigerator. As she started the engine, Margaret whispered a quiet prayer for help, not knowing that someone was already watching over her, preparing to change her life in ways she could never imagine. Thomas Whitmore stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sun rise over the Montana hills. At 41 years old, he had built something he was proud of. The Whitmore Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of prime cattle land, home to over 500 head of beef cattle. But success hadn't come easy. Tom remembered being 18 years old when his grandfather died and left him a small piece of land and $200. Everyone in town thought he was crazy for trying to start a ranch with so little money. They said he should sell the land and go to college like other young men his age. Tom had different plans. He worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week for the first 5 years. He built fences by hand, learned to treat sick cattle from library books, and slept in a tent, because he couldn't afford to build a house. Every penny he earned went back into buying more cattle and more land. Now, 23 years later, the Whitmore Ranch was one of the most successful cattle operations in 3 counties. Tom employed 12 full-time workers and their families, depended on the jobs he provided. He had built a comfortable house, owned good trucks, and had money in the bank. Despite his success, Tom lived simply. He still wore the same style of work clothes he had worn as a young man. He drove a clean but older pickup truck, didn't need fancy things to feel good about himself. What made Tom happiest was helping others in his community. Most people in Cedar Ridge didn't know about his quiet acts of kindness. When the Miller family lost their farm to bad weather, Tom bought their cattle for twice what they were worth. When old Mrs. Patterson needed surgery, Tom paid her medical bills and told her it was from a church fund. Tom believed in helping people without making them feel bad about needing help. He remembered what it felt like to struggle, and he never wanted anyone to feel ashamed for going through hard times. On this particular November morning, Tom needed to drive into town to pick up supplies at Henderson's general store. He loaded. His truck had made the 20-minute drive down the winding mountain road. The general store had been serving Cedar Ridge for over 50 years. It was the kind of place where you could buy everything from groceries to work boots to birthday cards. Tom liked shopping there because he knew the owners, Bob and Helen Henderson, worked hard to keep their prices fair for everyone in town. Tom parked his truck and walked into the warm store. The bell above the door rang as he entered, and Bob Henderson looked up from behind the counter with a friendly smile.
Morning, Tom.
What brings you to town today? Need some supplies for the ranch, Bob? How's business? Can't complain, Ellen's in the back organizing the new shipment. If you want to say hello. Tom nodded and grabbed a shopping cart. He walked through the aisles, picking up the items on his list. He needed work, gloves, some tools, and groceries for his house. As he turned into the canned goods aisle, Tom noticed a woman standing in front of the soup section. She was thin and pale, wearing a blue dress that looked too big for her small frame. Her brown hair was pulled back neatly, but Tom could see the worry lines around her eyes. The woman was holding a can of soup in one hand and counting coins in the other. She looked at the price tag, then at her money, then back at the price tag again. Tom watched as she put the can back on the shelf and picked up a smaller, cheaper one instead. Tom recognized her as the local school teacher, though he had never spoken to her directly. He knew her husband had died in an accident a few months ago. The whole town had talked about the tragedy, and Tom had attended the funeral along with most of the community. The woman, Margaret, continued shopping slowly through the store. Tom noticed she spent a long time looking at prices before putting anything in her basket. She picked up a loaf of bread, checked the price, and chose a day-old loaf that cost 50 cents less. At the meat counter, Margaret asked Bob about the cheapest ground beef he had available. Bob showed her the selection, and even the cheapest option seemed to make her hesitate. She bought half a pound instead of a full pound. Tom felt his heart sink as he watched this scene unfold. He could see Margaret was struggling, but she was trying hard to maintain her dignity. She spoke politely to Bob and Helen, smiled when they asked how she was doing, and acted like everything was fine. But Tom could see through the act. He had been poor himself, and he recognized the signs. The careful counting of money, the way she chose the cheapest option for everything, the small amounts she bought instead of stocking up like most people did when Margaret went to pay for her groceries. Tom was standing 2 aisles away looking at hardware supplies. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw Margaret count out exact change for her small collection of items. She had bought soup, bread, eggs, milk, and a small package of ground beef. Nothing extra, nothing unnecessary. After Margaret left the store, Tom approached Bob at the counter. "Bob, that was Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher, right?" "That's Margaret. Sweet lady. Been going through a tough time since her husband passed." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "She's not related to you and Helen, is she?" No. Just happens to have the same last name." "Why do you ask?" "Just wondering. She seems like a nice person." Tom paid for his own groceries and loaded them into his truck. But instead of driving straight home, he sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, thinking about what he had witnessed. He remembered his own grandmother telling him stories about the Great Depression, when neighbors helped neighbors survive the hard times. She always said that when you have more than you need, you should share with those who don't have enough. Tom had more than enough. His ranch was profitable, his bills were paid, and he had money saved for the future. Margaret clearly didn't have enough. She was working hard as a teacher, trying to take care of herself. It wasn't working. The question was how to help without making her feel embarrassed or like she was taking charity. Tom knew that pride could be both a blessing and a curse. It helped people maintain their self-respect during difficult times, but it could also prevent them from accepting help when they really needed it. Tom started his truck and drove home to his ranch, but his mind stayed focused on Margaret's situation. That evening, as he sat in his comfortable living room, he came up with an idea. The next morning, Tom drove to the grocery store in the neighboring town, 30 miles away. He didn't want anyone in Cedar Ridge to see him making his purchases. He bought good quality food, fresh meat from his own cattle that he sold to this store, vegetables, bread, milk, eggs, and pantry staples that would last through the winter. He also bought warm clothes, a thick winter coat in Margaret's size, warm gloves, and a wool blanket. Tom was good at judging sizes from his years of buying clothes for his ranch workers. That night, after dark, Tom loaded everything into boxes and drove to Margaret's small house on the edge of town. He carried the boxes quietly to her front porch. Trying not to make any noise that might wake her, he left a simple note that said, "Dear friend, someone in our community cares about you and wants to help during this difficult time. Please accept these gifts in the spirit they are given. You are not alone. A friend who cares." Tom drove home feeling better than he had in weeks. He didn't know if Margaret would accept the help or if she would try to find out who had left the gifts. But he knew he had done the right thing. The next few days, Tom found himself driving past the school more often than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of Margaret to see if she looked healthier or happier. He also started paying more attention to the local gossip, listening for any mention of mysterious gifts or anonymous helpers. Tom was beginning to care about Margaret Henderson in a way he hadn't expected, and he was determined to make sure she made it through the winter safely. Margaret woke up to find boxes on her front porch for the third time in 2 weeks. Each mysterious delivery had arrived in the early morning hours while she slept. The first time, she thought someone had made a mistake and left groceries at the wrong house. But the note had been addressed to her. The handwriting was clear and careful. She carried the boxes inside and unpacked them slowly. Fresh beef, vegetables, warm bread, milk, and pantry items that would last for weeks. There was also a beautiful wool coat in exactly her size, warm gloves, and a soft blanket. Whoever was leaving these gifts knew what she needed and cared enough to provide quality items. Margaret felt grateful, but also embarrassed. Someone in Cedar Ridge knew about her struggles. Despite her efforts to keep her problems private, it was obvious that she wasn't fooling everyone. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame. She had spent hours trying to figure out who her mysterious helper might be. Was it one of the other teachers at school? Maybe the principal, Mrs. Watson, had noticed Margaret wasn't eating lunch anymore. Or perhaps it was someone from the church, though Margaret rarely attended services these days. Gifts were expensive. The meat was high quality, and the coat looked like it came from the nice store in the next town over. This wasn't someone with limited means trying to help. This was someone with real money who could afford to be generous. Margaret tried asking subtle questions around town, but nobody seemed to know anything about anonymous gifts or mysterious helpers. Either her benefactor was very good at keeping secrets, or they had sworn other people to silence. For 2 weeks, Margaret's life improved dramatically. She was eating regular meals again, staying warm in her new coat, and sleeping better under the soft blanket. Her students noticed the change too. Little Amy told her she looked prettier. Kevin said she seemed happier during reading time, but then disaster struck again. The November storm hit Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday night with winds stronger than anyone had seen in years. Margaret lay in bed listening to the house creak and groaned as the wind battered it from all sides. She heard something crash outside but decided to wait until morning to investigate. When she woke up, Margaret discovered that a large tree branch had fallen on her roof during the storm. It had punched a hole right through the old shingles and rain was dripping steadily into her bedroom. She put a bucket under the leak and tried not to panic. Margaret called 3 different contractors for estimates on fixing the roof. The cheapest quote was $800, money she absolutely didn't have. The contractor explained that the damage was significant and would only get worse if she didn't fix it soon. That night, it rained again. Margaret moved her bed to the living room and put pots and buckets around the bedroom to catch the water. She lay awake listening to the steady drip, 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 and wondering what she was going to do the next morning. She was standing in her damaged bedroom, staring up at the hole in her roof, when someone knocked on her front door. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone, and she felt nervous about who might be visiting. She smoothed her hair and opened the door. A tall man stood on her porch, holding his hat in his hands. He had kind brown eyes and graying hair at his temples. Margaret recognized him as Tom Whitmore, the rancher who owned the big spread outside of town. She had seen him at community events and her husband's funeral, but they had never really talked. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Tom Whitmore. I hope I'm not bothering you." "Mr. Whitmore, of course. Please come in out of the cold." Tom stepped inside and looked around the small, neat house. He could hear water dripping somewhere in the back rooms. "I heard about the storm damage from Bob at the general store. I was wondering if I might take a look at your roof and see how bad it is." Margaret felt her cheeks flush red. "That's very kind of you, but I couldn't ask you to do that. I'm sure you have your own storm damage to deal with. Actually, my place came through fine. The buildings are newer and built to handle the wind. May I take a look? I know something about construction, and I might be able to help." Margaret hesitated. She barely knew this man, but he seemed sincere. She was desperate. "Well, if you really don't mind. The damage is in the back bedroom." Tom followed her through the house, noticing how clean and organized everything was, despite her obvious financial struggles. In the bedroom, he looked up at the hole in the ceiling and examined the water damage. "This needs to be fixed soon, or you'll have bigger problems. The wood will start to rot, and you might get mold growing in the walls." "I know. I've called for estimates, but ... Margaret's voice trailed off. She couldn't bring herself to admit she didn't have the money. Tom nodded as if he understood. "Mrs. Henderson, I have a business proposition for you. I've been looking for someone to help me with the office work at my ranch, bookkeeping, correspondence with cattle buyers, organizing records. It's work that could be done from your home in your spare time." Margaret looked surprised. "I don't know anything about ranching or cattle." "You don't need to know about cattle. You need to know about numbers and organization. You're a teacher, so I know you're good at both. The work would pay well, and I could arrange to have your roof fixed as part of your starting bonus." The offer seemed too good to be true. Margaret's mind raced with questions. Why was Tom Whitmore offering her this job now, right when she needed it most? Was this connected to the mysterious gifts somehow? "Mr. Whitmore, this is very generous, but I have to ask, why me? Surely there are other people in town who could do this work." Tom met her eyes directly. "Mrs. Henderson, I've heard good things about you from everyone in town. You're smart, hardworking, and trustworthy. Those are exactly the qualities I need in someone who would be handling my business finances. I appreciate that, but the timing seems very convenient. Are you offering me this job because you feel sorry for me?" Tom was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'll be honest with you. I know you've been going through a hard time since your husband passed, but I'm not offering you charity. I really do need help with my business, and I believe you're the right person for the job. If you do good work, you'll earn every penny I pay you." Margaret walked to the window and looked out at her small yard. The November sky was gray and threatening. More rain? In a few hours, she would have to go back to school and pretend everything was fine while water dripped through her bedroom ceiling. She turned back to Tom. "What exactly would this job involve?" "I sell cattle to buyers in several states. I need someone to keep track of all the sales, handle the paperwork, and manage the correspondence. I also need help organizing my financial records for tax purposes. Most of it could be done on evenings and weekends." "And you said it would pay well? $500 a month to start?" "More if you take on additional responsibilities." Margaret's heart jumped. $500 would solve most of her immediate problems and give her breathing room for the first time in months. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to think about this, of course. Take all the time you need. But I'd like to get started on your roof repair right away if you decide to accept. Winter's coming fast, and we shouldn't wait." After Tom left, Margaret sat in her kitchen thinking about his offer. It felt like a miracle, but it also felt suspicious. The timing was too perfect, and Tom's explanation didn't quite explain why. He had chosen her specifically. But as she listened to more water dripping into the buckets in her bedroom, Margaret realized she couldn't afford to be suspicious. Whether this was charity disguised as work or a genuine business opportunity, she needed to accept it. Her pride was less important than having a dry place to sleep and enough money to buy groceries. The next morning, Margaret called the number Tom had left and told him she would take the job. Margaret sat at her kitchen table on a cold December evening, surrounded by ledger books and business papers from Tom's ranch. 3 weeks had passed since she started working for him, and she was amazed at how much her life had changed. Her roof was completely fixed, better than it had ever been. Tom had hired the best contractor in the county, and now her bedroom stayed warm and dry even during the heaviest winter storms. The steady income from her new job meant she could buy groceries without counting every penny, and the constant worry that had kept her awake for months was finally starting to fade. But more than the financial relief, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the work. Tom's ranch operation was much more complex than she had imagined. He sold cattle to buyers in 5 different states, kept detailed health records for every animal, and managed contracts with feed suppliers, veterinarians, and transport companies. Margaret discovered she had a natural talent for organizing all this information. She created new filing systems that made it easier to track sales and expenses. She found mistakes in old contracts that had been costing Tom money for years. When she pointed out these errors, Tom was impressed by her attention to detail. "Saved me more money in 3 weeks than I would have paid you in 6 months," Tom told her during one of his visits to her house. These visits had become the highlight of Margaret's week. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, Tom would stop by to drop off new paperwork and discuss the business. What started as purely professional meetings gradually became something more personal. Margaret would make coffee, and they would sit at her kitchen table going over the numbers. But their conversations began to drift beyond cattle sales and profit margins. They talked about books they had read, places they wanted to travel, and memories from their childhoods. Margaret learned that Tom had built his ranch from almost nothing. His grandfather had left him 40 acres and very little money, but Tom had a vision of creating something bigger. He worked countless hours, made smart investments, and slowly expanded his operation year by year. "There were times I thought about giving up," Tom admitted one evening. "The first winter was especially hard. I was living in a trailer with no heat, eating beans and bread for every meal. Some nights I wondered if everyone was right about me. Being crazy for trying to start a ranch? What kept you going?" And the belief that hard work eventually pays off. "My grandfather always said that if you're willing to work harder than everyone else, you can achieve things that seem impossible." Margaret nodded, understanding that feeling completely. Teaching had its own challenges, and there had been many times over the years when she questioned whether she was making a real difference in her students' lives. Tom was curious about Margaret's teaching career, asked her about her favorite students, her biggest challenges, and what she loved most about working with children. "Every year I get to watch kids discover they can read," Margaret said, her eyes lighting up. "There's this moment when everything clicks for them, and suddenly words that looked like scribbles start making sense. It's like watching someone learn magic. You must be a good teacher. I've heard people in town talking about how much their kids love your class." Margaret felt a warm glow at the compliment. It had been a long time since anyone had praised her work or made her feel valued for her skills and talents. As Christmas approached, Tom started bringing small gifts along with the business papers. Nothing expensive or inappropriate, just thoughtful. Little things. A book he thought she might enjoy. A candle that smelled like pine trees. A warm scarf, he said, reminded him of her favorite blue dress. Margaret found herself looking forward to these gifts almost as much as she looked forward to seeing Tom. He had a way of choosing things that showed he was really paying attention to her likes and interests. The book was by an author she had mentioned enjoying. The candle was exactly the kind of scent she preferred. The scarf matched not just her dress, but also her personality, practical but pretty. One snowy evening in late December, Tom arrived at Margaret's house looking different somehow. Seemed nervous, fidgeting with his hat and avoiding eye contact while they reviewed the week's paperwork. "Is everything okay?" Margaret asked. "You seem distracted tonight." Tom set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "Margaret, I have something I need to tell you, and I'm not sure how you're going to react." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Was he going to fire her? Had she made some mistake with the books that cost him money? "Remember those anonymous gifts you were receiving before we started working together?" Margaret nodded, wondering where this conversation was heading. Those gifts came from me. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at Tom, processing what he had just admitted. She had suspected someone was watching her struggles, but she had never considered it might be Tom. You were the one leaving food on my doorstep. Yes. I saw you at Henderson's General Store one day, counting coins to buy soup. I could tell you were having a hard time, and I wanted to help. Margaret felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Gratitude, embarrassment, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I was afraid you'd be angry or embarrassed. I know how independent you are, and I didn't want you to feel like I was treating you like a charity case. But you were treating me like a charity case, Margaret said quietly. Tom shook his head. No, I wasn't. I was helping a neighbor who needed support during a difficult time. There's a difference. Margaret got up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the snow falling in the darkness. She thought about all the evenings they had spent together, all the conversations and shared laughter. Had it all been built on pity? Margaret. Tom said softly, I need you to know that my feelings for you aren't based on sympathy. Yes, I started helping you because I could see you were struggling. But I kept coming here, kept extending our business meetings, because I enjoy your company. You're smart, funny, and stronger than you realize. Margaret turned around to face him. Your feelings for me? Tom stood up, his hat still in his hands. I care about you, Margaret. More than I probably should, considering I'm your employer. These past few weeks, getting to know you, seeing how capable and resilient you are, I've developed feelings that go beyond friendship or business. Margaret felt her heart beating faster. She had been trying to ignore her own growing attraction. To Tom, telling herself it was just gratitude for his help. But the truth was, she looked forward to his visits for reasons that had nothing to do with work or money. But I don't know if I can trust these feelings. How do I know what's real and what's just me being grateful for your help? Tom stepped closer to her. I guess we'll have to figure that out together. But Margaret, I want you to know that even if you decided to quit working for me tomorrow, even if you told me to leave and never come back, I would still make sure you had everything you needed to get through this difficult time, my feelings. For you aren't conditional on your gratitude. Margaret looked into Tom's kind brown eyes and saw the sincerity there. For the first time in months, she felt like she could trust someone completely. I need time to think about all this, she said. Take all the time you need, Tom replied. I'm not going anywhere. As Tom prepared to leave that evening, he paused at the door. Margaret, whatever happens between us, I want you to know that you've helped me as much as I've helped you. These past few weeks have been the happiest I've been in years. After he left, Margaret sat by her window watching the snow fall, thinking about trust, love, and second chances. Margaret woke up on the first day of spring to the sound of birds singing outside her window. The harsh Montana winter had finally ended, and warm sunshine was streaming through her bedroom curtains. She stretched under her warm blankets, feeling something she hadn't experienced in almost a year. Genuine happiness. The past 3 months had been a time of slow healing and careful trust building. After Tom's confession about being her anonymous helper, Margaret had asked for space to sort through her feelings. Tom had respected her request, keeping their Tuesday and Friday meetings strictly professional while she worked through her emotions during those quiet winter weeks. Margaret had done a lot of thinking. She realized that her feelings for Tom were real and had nothing to do with gratitude for his financial help. She enjoyed his company, respected his intelligence, and felt comfortable in ways she hadn't experienced since before her husband died. Tom had proven his sincerity through his actions. He never pressured her for an answer about their relationship. He continued to treat her as an equal business partner, asking for her opinions on ranch decisions and implementing her suggestions. Most importantly, he had kept his promise to support her regardless of her romantic feelings, making it clear that her job was secure no matter what she decided about their personal relationship. By February, their Tuesday and Friday meetings had gradually become more relaxed again. They talked about books, shared stories about their childhoods, and laughed together over coffee. Margaret found herself looking forward to these evenings with an excitement that had nothing to do with business. One evening in early March brought news that would change both their lives. "I got a call from a cattle buyer in Texas," Tom said as they reviewed the week's sales figures. "It's the biggest single sale I've ever made." Margaret looked up from the ledger book, excited for him. "Tom, that's wonderful. How much money are we talking about? About $300,000? It would make this the most profitable year in the ranch's history." Margaret quickly calculated the numbers in her head. "That means you could expand the operation, maybe buy more land or increase the herd size." Tom nodded, but he looked thoughtful rather than excited. "Actually, I've been thinking about something different. What if instead of expanding, I use some of that money to start a college scholarship fund for kids in Cedar Ridge?" Margaret stopped writing and looked at him with surprise. "A scholarship fund? I've been thinking about it for months. There are so many smart kids in this town who can't afford college. It's like little Amy in your class. She's brilliant, but her family doesn't have money for higher education. What if we could help kids like her?" Margaret felt her heart swell with admiration. For this man who had already helped her so much and was now thinking about helping other people in their community, "That's a beautiful idea, Tom. But you said we. What did you mean by that?" Tom set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "Margaret, you've become my business partner in every way that matters. You understand the ranch's finances better than I do, and you care about this community as much as I do. I can't imagine making decisions like this without your input." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. For so many months, she had felt alone and helpless. Now she was being included in decisions that could affect the future of their entire community. "I think a scholarship fund is exactly the right thing to do," she said softly. Tom reached across the table and gently took her hand. "Margaret, I have something else I want to ask you." She looked into his kind brown eyes and felt her heart racing. "I know I told you to take all the time you needed to think about us, but it's been 3 months, and my feelings for you have only grown stronger. I love you, Margaret. It's not because I helped you through a difficult time, and not because you're grateful for what I did. I love you because you're smart, strong, compassionate, and beautiful. I love the way you care about your students, the way you've improved my business, and the way you make me want to be a better man." Margaret felt the tears she had been holding back start to flow down her cheeks. "Tom, I love you too. I've known it for weeks, but I was scared to admit it." Tom stood up and walked around the table to her. The question hung in the air between them. Margaret looked at this man who had saved her life in so many ways, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. He had restored her faith and kindness, shown her that she deserved love and respect, and made her believe in second chances. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Tom pulled her into his arms and kissed her gently. It was a kiss full of promise, hope, and deep affection that had grown slowly over months of getting to know each other. The news of their engagement spread through Cedar Ridge quickly. The whole town was thrilled that 2 of their most respected residents had found love together. Mrs. Watson, school principal, threw an engagement party at the school. Signs Margaret continued teaching through the rest of the school year while planning their wedding. She and Tom decided on a simple ceremony in June, held in the community center with the whole town invited, on their wedding day. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Tom had bought for her in the city. She carried wildflowers from the ranch, and her face glowed with happiness as she walked down the aisle to meet her husband -2-B. Little Amy was her flower girl, scattering rose petals and grinning with excitement. Several of Margaret's former students attended the ceremony, now grown up and starting families of their own. During the ceremony, Tom and Margaret exchanged vows they had written themselves. Tom promised to support Margaret's dreams and always treat her as an equal partner. Margaret promised to help him build not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of kindness in their community. After the wedding, Margaret moved to the ranch house that Tom had built years earlier. She kept teaching for 2 more years before deciding to focus full-time on their expanding business and community projects. The scholarship fund they established helped dozens of local students attend college over the years. They also started a program to provide free meals for families in need during the winter months. Always done quietly and anonymously to preserve people's dignity. Tom and Margaret's ranch became one of the most successful cattle operations in the state, but their greatest success was the love they built together. They faced the challenges of ranch life as true partners, supporting each other through difficult seasons and celebrating their victories together. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch watching the sunset over the Montana hills, remembering the dark winter when they first found each other. Margaret would often think about how close she had come to losing everything, and how one man's kindness had changed the entire course of her life. Tom would remember the pale, thin woman he had seen counting coins in the general store and marvel at the strong, confident woman she had become. Together, they had learned that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with compassion. Their marriage lasted 43 years until Tom passed away peacefully at age 84. Continuing their charitable work and telling their story to anyone who would listen, she wanted people to know that kindness matters, that second chances exist, and that love can bloom even in the darkest winters of our lives. The Tom and Margaret Whitmore Scholarship Fund still helps local students today, a lasting reminder of two people who chose love over fear and generosity over selfishness.